Dr. Majid Jawad. He will talk about age restriction in vaccination. Dr. Majid.
Thank you very much, Professor Maitham, for inviting me, and many thanks for the chairman, also Professor Salman Rawaf and speaker, and to Dr. Jasmine Azawi, who I really raise my hat, as they say, for taking hard measures against those who misinform the public and mislead them based on poor and wrong knowledge. And many thanks for Professor Shakir Jawad for his elegant presentation. Professor Jawad, with whom I share my surname, although I'm not related, but I love to be related, to take some of his good genes, actually. Right. Okay. So I'm going to talk about pediatrics and put my case as to why, whether you need it or not need it. But in order to understand why we, well, the case either to against or against the vaccination, you need to know some of the background. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen, if I may. Can you see my screen?
Yes. Yes.
So COVID-19 and when children get COVID vaccines. Professor Jawad Shakir Jawad already made my task easier by showing some of the facts, and I'm pleased that we agree, you know, together as well as with Professor Salman and some views. So these are the quickly the points I'm going to go through. COVID-19 in children, how serious and related, and the vaccines, etc. So how serious in children? The various studies from last year and throughout the second wave and the third wave in Europe showed that children relatively had it much easier or at a milder risk compared to adults with the COVID infection. It's less severe in children than adults. Children less than 12, milder illness versus teenager. Teenagers tend to share some of the adults, if you like, symptoms and some of the severities, okay? Especially when they exceed 16 plus. It's much lower death in children compared to adults. I'm referring this, relating this to immediate references to CDCs in UK, in United States, and some of the RCPCH and Evelina Royal Brompton and Imperial College observations and studies. Okay, and they have large number appear to be asymptomatic, according to large number of children tend to be asymptomatic, and that's where the important points we need to look at when we come to vaccines also. Teenagers are twice as likely with COVID as 5 to 11 years old. They can be, showing the symptom. Critical illness is very low in children, but still significant. And even though with low rate, of the 268 US children died to March, out of 13,500 hospitalized, not infected, hospitalized, okay? With regard to the clinical pictures, the majority have either fever, nearly 2/3, cough 1/3, rhinorrhea, and diarrhea and vomiting 10%, but no symptoms 15% or even more. And I'll show you some of the studies. Those who are at a higher risk of symptoms, those with asthma, chronic disease such as asthma, diabetes, genetic neurological problem, metabolic, sickle cell disease as in Iraq, heart disease since birth, medical complexity that requires support, ventilatory supports, etc. And obesity. I'm afraid BAMEs, obese children are at much higher risk for COVID-related complications, especially the PIMS or the MIC, as the American call it also. With regard to the pregnancy, it's the same, believe it or not, as children. They have it less severe than adults who are, you know, male adults or others. I'm not going to go to the studies of the amniotic fluid, but the newborn also have it mild only if they are premature. They may need some support. In children, I'm not going to go through the you know, individual studies, but this is one of the studies you know, for Spanish children, showed a small number, only one died out of 349. But of course, the second wave, third wave told us more, and we have accumulated lots of data since then. And there has been more death, of course, not handful as it was in the very beginning, first wave. And more of these COVID-like, you know, the multi-system inflammatory syndrome, which was first recognized in UK in March, April, when the Royal College presented its case definition for these cases, with the clinical picture and the inflammatory markers, etc., as it put it in May 2020, followed by Washington in USA, and then in New York, and then the WHO end of May put the case definition. Now, this PIMS, pediatric multi-system inflammatory syndrome, may represent like Kawasaki-like, or septic shock, or refractory shock, or combination of all. And that's the major symptoms they may present with the clinical pictures. 75% shock, myocardial in half of them, sequelae, rash in half of them, abdominal pain, and involvement, vomiting, diarrhea, more than half, acute kidney injury, 1/3, renal replacement requiring renal replacement, and respiratory in only 1/3, as opposed to much higher in adults. It's interesting that it showed that these cases followed 1 month after registering COVID cases in children in these countries. This means it's lagging behind. This means that there is a certain dysregulation, immunity dysregulation, that triggered this. And that's what happened, because many of these cases were COVID negative on PCR, but COVID positive on IgG and IgM antibodies, as Professor Shakir Jawad said. Kawasaki disease, described by the late Tomoshiro Kawasaki, who we sadly passed away last year in June, that it's a condition which defined as usually children with 5 days of fever and 4 out of 5 other features, like you know, composed of bilateral non-purulent conjunctivitis, polymorph xanthum, but not petechial, changes in extremities like peeling and redness, and changes in lips and lymphadenopathy. And it shows that in these children with the you know, red lips and strawberry tongue, mimicking other, you know, that's the skin rash and the non-purulent conjunctivitis and the lymphadenopathy, which is the least, and then peeling of the skin. And all of them are miserable with high inflammatory marker. They end up, but those who have the Kawasaki-like, they may end up even more with more coronary artery problems, but they are a smaller number, yet significant. So they think that it is the PIMS is part of the spectrum of Kawasaki, but it's dysregulation. Now, that's the pathophysiology of it. I'm not going to go through the immune complexes and disease activity, etc., but that's in a nutshell, dysregulation. Now, coming to children, do they need vaccine or not? Can we avoid, you know, are they, you know, would social distancing and, you know, help and not, you know, being contagious for children? No, children, unlike adults, they won't wear masks, I'm afraid, especially babies, something who are infected. Although the infection are more common once they reach 10 to 15 years, they are as infectious as adults. Many studies showed that. Whereas in very young infants, less infectious. Okay. Now, how common COVID? Infection in children more common. Research in Mississippi, just one area, if I show you, between May and September last year, showed 9,000 cases reported, but the COVID antibodies positive when they did blood test is 114,000 cases. Can you imagine 13-fold more than what was reported? Means they were asymptomatic. Now, these children were most likely contagious to adults. So that's the case for, and asymptomatic children are a high source of transmission. So when do children get vaccinated and why have not been enrolled? Well, the case against COVID, of course, vaccination in children, that COVID remain mild generally, by and large, okay, compared to adults. Low morbidity and mortality, especially in the very young, okay, but lack evidence of long-term safety in adults. Well, of course, you won't get long safety unless you try it. Otherwise, you will all die eventually from, So you need the COVID vaccine, of course, for adults. This is in support of my colleagues, Professor Salman Al-Waf and Shakir Jawad, that vaccinate, and vaccinate. Okay, and there are, of course, ethical issues and limitation by regulators. Whenever you have any trials in history, they are started in adults, not in children, because of various ethical issues, because of limitation by regulators, because of the exclusivity. It's called also the things related to markets, etc., etc. And I'm not, in depth or immunologist or public health to comment on these. Children, for vaccines, the case for vaccines, that every child carries the virus has the potential to create a variant of concern. So they may, and by the way, 25% of the population in the United States, 25% children by definition. Now, this is far more in developing countries because of the life expectancy in these countries is less. So you have more younger populations and more children. So in Iraq, Egypt, elsewhere, you'll have more, of course, young people. So there's a case for vaccinate. And they say that the Canadian Public Health CDC, they say that, Dr. Sharma, they said that in order to achieve herd immunity there, you need 90%. I will leave this to public health and to immunologists. But you will never achieve this if you don't immunize children, then you will never, but of course, even though, we are achieving at some point a herd immunity in UK, but that's also by virtue of a huge campaign of vaccination, 20 million so far, as well as the infected people. And vaccination is required to protect the vulnerables, of course, because there are lots of vulnerables. And according to the Joint Committee of Vaccination and Immunization, the vaccination needing for high risk in UK, but sooner or later it will come to be to involve. The current trials already, Professor Shakir Jawad alluded on some. Pfizer and BioNTech in March 31st, last month only, they made a public announcement of the COVID vaccine for adolescents, 100%. As Professor Shakir Jawad, I agree with him, 100% robust responses. Okay, safe. So the phase 3 trial passed 12 to 15 years, but it's not yet approved by the FDA. Okay, but soon it's going to be approved. Canada is likely to approve 12 to 15 years. Okay, Moderna, including 5 to 11 years in Canada. AstraZeneca, trying 12 to 17 years. That's February announcement. And I have to say, Sinovac, the Chinese are trying, or even though they are not approved in Canada or elsewhere, Sinovac, but in children, they are trying it even from at the age of 3 years plus. And of course, Pfizer now trying on the 6 month plus, as Professor Shaka Joa has also showed, and Johnson & Johnson. That's a joke, of course. That's a bojo. Johnson & Johnson's, as Boris Johnson, are trying also their children one. I shall leave you with this. So to take home messages that COVID-19 remain mild in children with very low mortality, smaller but significant number gets inflammatory multisystem syndrome in children. Incidence of COVID in children is higher than previously thought, as shown in the antibodies test. Children remain important source of transmission, I'm afraid. Vaccination for COVID is underway, but not yet approved fully, or by FDA. Or controversy of whether to vaccinate all children at a high risk. High risk now are at the top to be vaccinated in UK by the JCVIC and JCVI, Joint Committee of Vaccination and Immunology, and the Green Book, which illustrate and summarize the vaccination for people. And my personal view, and in order to achieve great immunity in the community and to protect us as well, I think the case is to vaccinate in the future for children, especially as it is safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Majid Jawad.